My given name is Henry William Brands. I go by H.W. Brands. That's what you see on books and identifications in public. Friends call me Bill. I got into this business. I was reflecting on it yesterday. I have been teaching since 1977, so it's been quite a while. And I consider that what I do is primarily teaching. I also write, but I consider my writing to be an extension of my classroom. The audience that I'm aiming for these are people who, by and large, are not history majors. They're certainly not historians or history graduate students. They're people who are generally interested in the world. And I try to explain the world to them, at least the part of the world that I'm writing about. I've wandered all over the field of American history, but that's primarily because my interests have taken me in those different directions. And they give me a chance to kind of explore the past. I'm still as curious about the world as I was when I started this. And I think that teaching gives me a wonderful opportunity to indulge my curiosity, to find out new stuff, and then share what I've found out with my students and with my readers. So I feel very fortunate to be able to do what I do.
That's amazing. Do you mind if we jump right into some student questions?
Oh, yeah, sure.
All right, cool. Someone had emailed me. I think this came from France. One of the students wanted to know what was the focus of your PhD thesis at the University of Texas, Austin?
Okay, that's a good question. So my PhD thesis, which became my first book, was a study of the foreign policy of the Dwight Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. The book was called Cold Warriors, and it was a collective biographical sketch of foreign policy makers in the Eisenhower administration. Now, it was a little bit unusual for an academic dissertation. Usually they don't take a biographical form or even a collective biography. Usually they're more devoted to some particular issue, some particular approach to, in this case, foreign policy. But I wrote it this way in part because I simply think of history in terms of the people who were there. I'm aware of big movements in history and events in history, but to me, the interesting thing is, how is it that individuals make history? I distinguish in my classes and in my books between two streams of history, or channels of history, threads of history, as I think of them. I call them big history and little history. And big history is a history of public events. It's the stuff you read in the newspapers and you see on television. It's the history of the Industrial Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the Civil War and the Renaissance and the Reformation and stuff like that. Big stuff that happens to lots and lots of people at once. That's big history. And that's mostly what history books are about. But then there's little history. Little history is the history of individual lives. It's what you had for breakfast this morning. It's what you hope to do tomorrow, what you are going to do with your career. It has a lot to do with personal relations in a way that big history doesn't. When we talk about why Franklin Roosevelt led the United States into World War II, we really don't spend a whole lot of time talking about his relationship with his wife, Eleanor. But in fact, his relationship with his wife, Eleanor, had a great effect on the way he lived his life and why he did what he did. So to me, the great interest in history lies in this intersection between big history and little history. The little history is the private lives, the individual lives. The big history is what they add up to.
Very good, very good. One of our kids, they had wanted to know if you could discuss, you've been nominated for multiple Pulitzer Prizes, correct?
Yeah.
So we have students in Spain, Italy, France, Latvia, Germany, Nevada, Florida, Texas on this right now. The kids want to know, what is that process like when you have something nominated for a Pulitzer Prize?
Well, in the case of the Pulitzer Prize, it is very opaque, and it's also it's wonderful, of course, if you win. I didn't win; I was nominated a couple of times, and I was a finalist. But it's a little bit, it's kind of a letdown because they don't tell you that you were a finalist until they tell you you've lost. So you get this nice letter that says, "Congratulations, you were a finalist and you lost." Now, actually, there is another book prize that I was nominated for where they do it differently. And it's appropriately in Los Angeles. It's the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. And this is Los Angeles, the home of Hollywood. And so they do it much like the Academy Awards, where they tell you and the world in advance who the finalists are. And they take you to, brought me out to LA. And so you're sitting there in an auditorium as the envelope comes out and they read, and the winner is. So until that point, you think it might be me, it might be me. But for the Pulitzer Prize, by the time you learn that you were honored to be nominated, you learn it's not you.
That has to be a wild, wild ride to be a part of that. Let's talk about going from one extreme to another. We have a fellow historian, or he's interested in history. This is Anthony. He is in France. Anthony, you can unmute.
Eh,
You had a very good question.
Hello, thank you to be here with us. And I would like you said, to study history in my future and to become like you, teacher, researcher in history. I'm from France, so maybe more French history, but I like American history too. And I would like to know what piece of advice you could give me. Thank you.
Okay, this is a very good question. And I have to say that not knowing what the job market is for history professors in France, I can't speak directly to that. I will say that if somebody wants to be a history teacher, and I'll cast it more broadly, and this could include teaching at a university, but it also could include teaching at a high school, a middle school, at community colleges we have in the United States. There will be jobs for history teachers. So that's important to bear in mind. I don't know what the job market specifically for university historians is in the United States. It's changing fairly rapidly. So, but I will say this, that anyone who is interested in becoming a history teacher at any level, the best thing you can do now, or really at any time, is simply to read as much history as possible. Follow your interests and don't feel that you have to specialize in anything. Don't feel that you have to have a particular reading list that you should follow. No, I assume that if you're interested at all in being a history teacher or professor, you're interested in history. So keep doing what you're doing. But the key is to read as much as you can. And I will say, read a particular kind of history. And I'll tell you that this is what hooked me on history. Somehow or other, I got my hands on journals and diaries and old letters of people from history. I remember, well, one of the first collections that I read was the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the explorers across the American West in the early 1800s. And I was just fascinated because in reading the journals, I thought this is really different than reading history books. When I read most history books, I thought I was listening to a lecture, basically. And I will confess that as somebody who lectures all the time, I don't particularly like lectures. I like to be the lecturer, but I don't like to sit in lectures. And I will just add that when I'm teaching, when I'm giving my lectures, it's really a conversation with my students. I don't talk all the time. I bring them in. But to see the history through the eyes of the people who were there, as perhaps you know, historians call these primary sources. They were generated by the participants or eyewitnesses. Read that. And you can find them. I mean, nowadays you can find them online. You can find them in libraries. But if that hooks you, then you really have the makings of being a historian, because what the historian does is to take these primary sources, the evidence left behind by the participants, the people who were there, and then convert that into a story that can engage people today. I'll add one last thing. So I'm a teacher and a writer. And in my case, the two are connected to each other, but they don't have to be. Some of the most successful historians, certainly in the United States, and I know this is true in other countries, are not teachers. So you can become a historian without being a teacher. You don't have to have a degree to become a historian. If you can write good history, then you will find an audience and people will read it. I'll add something else. Certainly in my career, the emergence of historical documentaries as a way of conveying history has become a big deal. I remember when the History Channel was just getting started in America. And so, this was relatively new, but We live in a time when a whole lot of people get their history not primarily through reading, but through watching. And it's a perfectly valid way of conveying the past. So it may be that your generation and generations to come will get more history in sort of video form or whatever the next version of the media will be. And that's definitely a viable option. And there again, you don't have to have a professional license. You don't have to get a university degree or a graduate degree in history to do that. Some of the most successful people don't have degrees. They just have an interest and they follow. And so I would say that, follow your interest and see where it leads you.
Brilliant advice. So you touched on this a little bit with the History Channel stuff. So you have written so many books. You have been on so many episodes on the History Channel, America, the Story of Us, and all that. Do you have a favorite time period that you just absolutely love studying about?
Yeah, I'm recurrently drawn to the 19th century. So the period from 1800 to 1900. And the reason for this is that in 1800, the United States, it had just emerged as the United States of America, but it looked nothing like the United States does today. It was geographically, it was just this strip of states along the Atlantic coast of North America. People who, men and women, wore clothes that looked very different than they do today. And the fundamental institutions of American life. Today, if you have to characterize the United States in the terms of its institutions, value systems, you can do it in 2 words: capitalism and democracy. Capitalism is the way we've organized our economic affairs, democracy, our political affairs. So that's true of America today. In 1800, the United States was not yet a democracy, and it did not yet have a capitalist economy. So in 1800, the United States was really old-fashioned. By 1900, the United States looked quite modern. The map of the United States in 1900 is not very different from the map of the United States today. Capitalism had emerged, democracy had emerged. If you took somebody from off the street of New York in 1900, if it was a man, he would be wearing clothes very comparable with what men wear to work in Wall Street today. Women's dress wasn't that much different. So the reason I say that is there's a lot of changes in America that create modern America that happened between 1800 and 1900. And so that's why I find it most interesting. One last thing is personal to me, and that is I grew up in the west of the United States. I grew up in the state of Oregon. And so I'm recurrently drawn to the history of the West. And the history of the American West it really does zero in on the 19th century. So Lewis and Clark, early in the century, and then finally the closing of the frontier and the end of the century. So it's that period that I'm drawn to again and again.
That is absolutely fascinating. We'll go with a couple more student questions and we'll let you go. So this comes from myself. I read one of your quotes. You said, "Our love for the founders leads us to abandon and even betray the very principles they fought for." Like what would be like could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So a funny thing has happened in American history regarding the people who founded the American Republic. They have been placed on pedestals where you used to see them all on statues. And people have come to think of them as a different breed of individual than we are, that they had virtuous thoughts about America, and they were selfless and they were brave and they did all this wonderful stuff that we can never do. And I mean, some of this is kind of a natural thing that happens when you talk about people in the past. There's an aura that sometimes comes around it. But I think this really does a disservice to us because it supposes that what they did in the 1770s and 80s is something we could not do today. Now, there are reasons that we're not doing today what they did then, but to think that they were somehow smarter, more virtuous, more civic-minded than we are is quite a mistake. And in fact, my most recent book called Founding Partisans is about the emergence of party politics in the 1780s and 1790s. And one of the points that I do make is that these guys, and they were, in those days in politics, they were all men, they looked and acted like people today. If there's a single lesson that I've drawn from history, it's that no generation is more or less virtuous than generations before and after. We're basically humans, and we're all trying to figure out how we make our way through the world. So just this week, just a few days ago, I gave the final lecture of the year to the students in my large course on American history. And it's a course that spans from colonial times to the present. And one of the points that I make is, in America, and it's true of some other countries, but not all other countries. In America, we are responsible for the history we create. And I tell them, if you don't like, I'm speaking to students about your age, I'm a little bit older. So these are 18 and 19-year-old students. I say, if you don't like the world that you are entering into now as an adult, don't blame yourself. It's not your fault. You didn't create the world, but you will live probably another 50 years. I tell them, believe it or not, one day you will be as old as I am. And if you don't like the world then you do have to blame yourself, because basically I and my generation are handing it off to you. Now it's yours to make or remake. So do the best you can. So
you had a really good quote, because we connected during the whole build the wall thing years and years ago, and you were talking about how history is a perspective. When you're looking at history, you have to look at it in the context of which you're reading that. And I found that it seems so simple, but just absolutely brilliant to like bring that up to the students. So,
well, it's a reminder that a lot of people, they use history for other purposes than history. What they want is they want something from history to score political points or make political progress today. But if you want to understand history, now I say that the fundamental question that historians should be asking of the past, and that students of history should be asking of the past, is what were they thinking? What were they feeling? How did the world look to them? And in order to make sense of that, you have to forget everything you know about what happened later. So when George Washington is at Valley Forge, you have to forget that the Americans are going to win the Revolutionary War and the Continental Army is going to hold together, because at the time, you don't know if it is or not. And so it's quite unfair to earlier generations. It's actually unfair to us as well, if we simply take our values from today and impose them on the past and say, well, you don't measure up on this, or that. I say it's unfair to them because, of course, they didn't know where the world was going, but it's unfair to us as well, because it makes us think that, well, okay, there's some standard of perfection we ought to measure up to. But the fact is that history is always a work in progress. And we like to think that we're making progress, but to either put the past on a pedestal and say we can't ever reach that standard, or always to be looking down on the past and saying what scoundrels you were because you don't measure up to our standard, it doesn't do history any good, and neither does it do us any good.
brilliant. So we'll go with a couple more student questions. This is Sergio. You can unmute. You had an awesome question. You're in Spain. So Sergio, go ahead and ask.
Okay, I also like history, and my question is how automation and AI will affect historians and historians teachers.
Sergio, I was having this conversation with some of my colleagues just last evening. And, what are we going to do about AI? Because it makes it really tempting for students to lean on. And I had some students in one of my classes who were using artificial intelligence, and I could tell by simply the way it read. When I read a lot of essays, and I read something that was generated by AI, one of the things that comes out of it is a kind of emotional flatness to it. It's as though the AI doesn't want to offend anybody. So there's no opinion, there's no point of view there. And so I talked to the students and said, how is it that you use this? And I will say that a couple of the students who used it were Chinese students. So I have a lot of international students. And they had been in a country, they're at the University of Texas, but they had studied English language in school, but they certainly didn't feel, it certainly wasn't their first language. And it was tough for them to keep up with the reading and then to do the writing. And they explained that they had AI summarize some stuff for them. And I thought, okay, that's perfectly reasonable. And so I don't know really what the answer to your question is. I do know that AI is getting better, a lot faster than some people expected, so that AI of 2 years, a year and a half ago, when it was first released on the world, it's almost archaic now. And the stuff that is produced today is simply a lot better. I think that at least for the time being, for the historian like me, artificial intelligence conceivably can be used as a research assistant. Now, I don't personally use research assistants, but some of my colleagues and other historians do. So they have bright young people who they will go read these 3 books on history and summarize them so that the person they're working for doesn't have to read those whole books themselves. And that's perfectly understandable use of it. And I think that AI probably will be reasonably good there. I'm certainly not to the point where I would use artificial intelligence to write a draft of a book that I was writing, if only because one of the reasons I write is I enjoy writing and I don't want to farm that out to anybody else. So it remains to be seen how it's going to affect the writing of history. I mean, one thing that is certainly going to be an issue is when let's say 20 years from now, am writing about somebody and I say, okay, so-and-so wrote this letter on this particular, let's say they wrote the letter in the year 2026. Will I be confident that the person actually wrote the letter, or was the letter written by artificial intelligence? But I've been dealing with things like this in the past. I wrote a book on the Civil War, and I thought, the Civil War, this is the dawn of photography. And so if you see a photograph and Ulysses Grant is placed in this particular place, okay, then there he was. I didn't realize that they had the equivalent in those days of Photoshop, where they could change the photos. And so I just wasn't looking for that. And later I did. And now you look at it more closely. But it is going to change things. And we just don't quite know how. So I think we're going to have to be flexible.
That is astonishing. That's a really good point. Was it written by AI or by humans when they go to the future? All right, we have our final student question, and we're going to kick it back to Anthony in France. Anthony, go ahead. You had a question about American history.
Yes, thank you for your previous answer to my question. And I have another question about studies in history, because in France, study in history are very related to studies in geography. And is it your case in America or not? Thank you.
Well, yeah. So in fact, I sometimes think that if I had not majored in history, I would have majored in geography, because I'm fascinated about how where people live affects how they live, and where people live just sort of in a continent, in a country, how they are arranged spatially. And one of the striking things about the field of geography, as it's practiced in universities, is that geographers, they are these intellectual empire builders. There's nothing that's not geography to them, because everything takes place somewhere, and the spatial relations among individuals are important. So yes, and I mentioned earlier that I'm from the western part of the United States. And just to give you one example, growing up on the West Coast, I looked east and I thought, well, okay, Denver's well east of Oregon, and it's east of the Rockies. So when I was a kid, I thought of Denver as being in the eastern part of the United States. Well, nobody in the eastern part of the United States would think of Denver as anything but the far west. And when I looked at Chicago, I thought, well, Chicago's, it's probably a suburb of New York City. Well, it's not. It's 1,000 miles from New York City. But it works in the other way around. There's a famous cartoon, actually it was a cover of the New Yorker magazine, which shows the United States, North America, as envisioned by New Yorkers. And so you're in the foreground, you can see the Empire State Building and Wall Street, and then you can see the Hudson River, and then sort of everything beyond the Hudson River. By the time you get to New Jersey, it kind of blends together. So yeah, the role of geography and spatial awareness is really crucial. So my next book is going to be on the debate between Franklin Roosevelt and Charles Lindbergh over whether the United States should enter World War II. And one of the things you can observe in this debate is Americans who lived on the coasts were much more inclined to get involved in World War II than Americans who lived in the interior. And part of this was Americans on the East Coast, well, they were closer to the war in Europe, And Americans on the West Coast were closer to the war that had already broken out in Asia between Japan and China. And Americans in the middle, in Chicago, for example, which in fact was the center of American isolationism, they thought, we've got this extra buffer from the rest of the world. So yeah, geography and history, to me, they fit very closely together.
That is fascinating. I never thought about that. Now, is there anywhere that you would recommend for kids to go to get your books? Because I've seen them on Amazon, I've seen them on Penguin Publishing. Where do you recommend? Because you have a lot of books.
They're pretty much all on Amazon.
Okay.
And I have been publishing in the age when books, by and large, don't go out of print. And so they're always available somewhere. And most of them are now on Kindle. And, so some readers say, well, I got your book, but they say sort of apologetically that I listened to it rather than read it. And I said, that's fine. In fact, it's for the author, it's something that I do consider. So if somebody's going to be consuming what I've produced in audio form, for example, rather than in visual form, how does that change the way I will write? Just a very simple thing. When you know that somebody's going to be reading a page of what you wrote, paragraphs matter. Okay, so paragraph, this is block of print, and it's a visual relief. Okay, I'm at the end of the paragraph, now I'm going to change things. When you hear something, you usually don't hear paragraphs. It just kind of all runs together. But the books are widely available. So Amazon's a good place as any to start.
That's great. And then how many books in total? Because I lost count of how many books you've authored.
No, I don't know the exact answer because I don't know exactly what to consider a book. I've been an editor of books, but it's about 3 dozen or so. So
just that.
Yeah.
So, and I'm a huge fan of your work from America, the Story of Us, the History Channel work, all of that stuff. So I don't know if you guys haven't checked that out. Definitely check that out if you have streaming services. So our final question, this always comes from me, Dr. Brandt, Dr. H.W. Brandt. What kind of advice would you have for these kids as they go off into the world and figure out what they want to do, whether it has to do with history or something completely different?
Okay. I'm going to assume that most of you remember from your mathematics classes the concept of Venn diagrams, those circles and where they overlap. So think in terms of 3 circles. One is the circle of things you like to do. What do you like to do? What would you do on your own, regardless of whether anybody made you or paid you? The second circle is what you are good at. Okay. And sometimes, what you like to do and what you're good at, they're not exactly the same, but usually there's an overlap. Then the third circle is what will somebody actually pay you to do? So you can be good at something, you can like something, but if there's no market for it, it can be a hobby, but it can't be a career. So if you want to find a career, and by the way, when you get out of school, don't immediately feel as though you have to find your career. Try something. You can learn something, whatever you're doing, whatever circumstance you're in. But eventually be thinking of, what do I like doing? What am I good at? What will somebody pay me to do? And in that place where the 3 circles intersect, that's what you're going to wind up doing. That's what you want to be doing with your life.
Solid advice. I love it. So before I let you go, before I end this meeting for all, I'm going to allow everyone to unmute. And can we all collectively say thank you to Dr. H.W. Brandt and the University of Texas Austin for taking time out of his day to come talk to us. Thank you so much, Dr. Brandt. We appreciate you greatly.
Very good. It's wonderful to talk to you. Good luck to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.